It's about time that we give one of our favourite genres a little health check and see if the future is 60 miles up or 6 feet down. A word of warning, short answers and uncomplicated statements might be all the rage right now, but the truth takes work. So if you came here for a one-line answer, then you're going to be disappointed. Hi, I'm Calvin, and today we're going to talk about RTS and if the rumours of its demise have been somewhat exaggerated. So let's start with the simple thing that everyone loves to bring up. Is RTS a dead genre? I guess it's a valid question, but the real problem is, what do we mean by dead? The answer is going to be wildly different depending on what the phrase means to you. If we're going to take this seriously, then the term dead has enough finality in its definition that we must take that into account when assessing its meaning in terms of a genre of video games. Dead can't simply mean stale, niche, or declining popularity, as those terms already exist. So unless you're going to be flippant just for the sake of it, we can only really apply the term dead to a genre that no longer has any interest from professional publishers, lacks much in the way of community engagement, and only has the support of a few dedicated diehards. The only honest way to start to answer this question is to look at the popularity of RTS in the past, and the problem here is that sales numbers and concurrent player figures are notoriously hard to track for games that were released in the 90s or the 2000s. These sorts of numbers weren't often publicly recorded back then, and a lot of the reporting that did happen was all hard copy that never made it onto the internet. Alongside that, this was before digital distribution and digital rights management. Even disregarding outright piracy, a single copy of a game was often shared between households or friends. I remember many a LAN party where each one of us would place the CD into the drive, load up the game, and then pass the CD to the person next to us who would do the same in turn. With those provisos aside, the few figures that we do have give us a pretty good indication that from the release of Command & Conquer in the few years that followed, RTS was a huge deal. The big names in this initial push had sales figures that matched the more popular releases from other genres, with numbers of copies sold frequently passing 6 figures. This was understandable, as genres aside, the games associated with this initial period were all of a very high quality. The interest in those early releases spawned a huge amount of other games that swamped the market, but even if you remember some of these quite fondly, none of them really had anything like the impact of the major franchises. Things started to settle down by the time we got to the mid-2000s. In a way, this is totally understandable. When any new exciting thing hits the market, there is normally an initial spike of great interest, followed by a decline that evens out to more sustainable levels. It's the same with games themselves. If you look at the concurrent Steam players of many new games, you'll see a similar graph, a huge peak, followed by a dip, and then a reasonable levelling out, with a few additional high spots as more content is released. It's not a perfect comparison, but you get the gist. The problem with assessing RTS this way is there's a bit of a spanner in the works. You see, if we had the popularity over time graph, it should look something like this. A huge amount of interest generated by the release of C&C starts a big spike which continues on as other excellent games are released. As we move into the 2000s, the interest is still quite high, but popularity is steadily declining, as follow-up games tend to get a lot less traction than the initial bunch. However, because of the aforementioned spanner, the graph probably doesn't look anything like this at all. So now, I guess it's time to talk about Starcraft. It's really hard to overstate both the impact of Starcraft and how its popularity isn't really representative of the genre as a whole. In short, the success of the Starcraft franchise isn't because it consisted of 2 great games in a popular genre, but rather a whole collection of situational, cultural, and political reasons that propelled a great game to an almost legendary status. The topic is large enough and interesting enough to warrant a whole book on the subject, but so you can fully understand what I'm talking about, I need to give you at least the edited highlights before we proceed. The first factor is quick and easy. Starcraft is an excellent game. You might not personally enjoy it, but you would have to be particularly close-minded to make any claim to the contrary. It has the classic elements of any popular game or sport. It's accessible, easy to learn and difficult to master. The low barrier of entry, high skill ceiling and great gameplay means that everyone from casual campaign enjoyers to top esports professionals can get involved and be part of the experience. The second factor is a lot more involved. In the 90s, South Korea had just become a democracy, and part of the new government's plans was a huge swathe of modernisations. One of these was to use the National Telecommunications Organisation to install high-speed broadband to pretty much every major building in the country. Later in the same decade, the Asian financial crisis hit. This had the expected results of any financial crisis. Unemployment rose, faith in existing institutions evaporated, and many found themselves priced out of their previous hobbies and avenues of entertainment. But the country did have three things: people that needed work, people that needed fun, and a high-speed broadband network that was the envy of the world. This led to the rise of internet cafes, or PC bangs as they are known locally. Internet cafes were ideally suited for this particular combination of events. They had a relatively low startup cost compared to other businesses that rely on things like large premises, transport, machinery and merchandise. They're also cash heavy with low bookkeeping requirements, perfect for a society whose respect for financial institutions is at an all-time low. These PC bangs opened in their tens of thousands all over the country and provided a venue for the cash-strapped population to play games and socialise with their friends, as well as allowing the even poorer members of society to have access to a PC and an internet connection, something they never could have afforded at home. At just the right time, Starcraft and then Brood War were released, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a more perfect pairing between product and market. You didn't even have to buy the game if you were going to play over a local network, as long as at least one person present had a copy. Even then, online accounts weren't actually tied to the CD key itself, so if the cafe had a copy for each of its computers, then anyone could just log in with their account and play the game without any restrictions. It's also worth noting that Starcraft wasn't written off as something for the nerds as it might have been in other cultures. This gets even deeper than my own understanding, but briefly, technology and the internet were seen as important, intellect was highly valued, and a country founded on a war that was still in living memory, and one that still had national service and an unhinged neighbour, would find respect for things like skill and strategy came easy. Simply put, Starcraft was cool, and if you were good at Starcraft, you were cool, and if you were really good at Starcraft, then you were very cool indeed. The next steps pretty much took care of themselves. If an activity is competitive and there is prestige in winning, then people will compete for that prestige. And as competitions became better organised and more widely recognised, people start to compete for prizes. Big money means big business. Companies start getting involved and sponsoring teams and prize pools, which requires coverage, commentary and everything else that goes with it. And before you know it, esports is born. This wasn't just a major publisher or an energy drink throwing a few $100,000 into the mix to promote their latest product. This was Samsung sponsoring teams, broadcast TV showing tournaments, and the Korean Ministry of Culture funding the construction of dedicated esports stadiums. This huge, unparalleled success soon started to leak out of South Korea into other parts of the world. It never reached the same sort of level, it didn't have the perfect combination of elements to do so, but the effect was notable as players got interested and publishers tried to replicate the success of Starcraft. As time moved on, popularity started to wane a little, but then Starcraft 2 was released in 2010 and it gave the whole machine another big lift for a few years. These days, things are different. Esports isn't something only associated with Starcraft and South Korea. Many other games like Counter-Strike and Dota 2 have both expanded and diluted the pool. And that brings us back to our original graph. This is what I said it should look like, but if we include the Starcraft series into the mix, then it probably looks something more like this. Instead of a big spike of interest before levelling out, we get a huge spike in initial popularity, which remains consistently high for years with the second spike starting in 2010, and then a constant downward trend which continues to fall to this day. If you're still desperate for a concise summary, then the best thing I can do is this. RTS wasn't that popular in the 2000s and the 2010s. Starcraft was. Starcraft's staggering success gave a lot of publishers, developers and players the false impression that RTS was a really popular genre, which is the reason they assumed the whole thing was in decline when the interest in Starcraft started to fade. I think it's an interesting point, and it does make you wonder if any other genres are in the same boat. Maybe MOBAs could be a good case study. Do millions of people love MOBAs, or do they just love Dota 2 and League of Legends? Pretty much every other game in that genre faded into nothing some time ago, and the occasional new game that's released in that style never seems to get any traction. Anyway, enough about Starcraft, but what about other game releases? After all, you can hardly call a genre healthy if no one ever releases any games within it. I've decided to make a little list of the more well-known releases over the last 15 or so years. My criteria is pretty loose. I'm either choosing games from bigger publishers or games from smaller studios that have got a lot more promise or interest. I've also included a few remasters, but only if they were well received by the players. 2009 and 2010 had a few notable releases. Halo Wars is pretty well regarded, as was Supreme Commander 2. Dawn of War 2 was a bit of a mixed bag, but you could argue about that forever. But I think we're all in agreement that Tiberium Twilight was a massive disappointment. I couldn't find anything interesting for the next couple of years, though it's worth noting I've left Starcraft 2 off this list as I've talked about that for far too long already. 2013 and 14 was a bit more interesting with Company of Heroes 2, which, has to be said, is one of my favourite games. Planetary Annihilation was also great, and the HD remaster of Age of Empires was probably worth doing. 2015 was one of my favourites. The Homeworld remaster was such a treat and something I was so glad to add to my collection. The next few years would see a lot of sequels and remasters, something that's plagued gaming for a while now and isn't limited to RTS by any stretch of the imagination. Some were better than others. Age of Empires 4 is a pretty solid game. Company of Heroes 3 had a weak start, but it has seen some improvement since, and if the reviews of Homeworld 3 are anything to go by, then that's probably best avoided. However, the future is looking quite promising. As well as the usual sort of fare, there are a few interesting titles set for release over the next year or two. Stormgate is hoping to take over where Starcraft left off. Industrial Annihilation is something for the macro lovers out there, and if the demo for Tempest Rising is anything to go by, then it's got a fair chance of bringing some Command & Conquer style gameplay back into the mix. These are just the big names, and the smaller studios like Slitherine always have something in the works. I think they've just released a new DLC for their Starship Troopers RTS. It might not be the richest pickings we've ever seen, but studios still seem to be interested in releasing real-time strategy games, so I don't think we'll have any shortage of things to play. The last thing we should really consider is community. I think it would be a bit crass to count Discord service and subreddits and use that as some sort of data point, so we're going to stay away from that particular train of thought. One thing I have noticed over recent times is the number of community projects that are trying to bring classic games like Red Alert, Dune 2000 and Total Annihilation to a whole new audience. Their success levels vary a lot, but the very fact that they exist in the first place is definite evidence of a will to participate. There are also some really innovative ideas springing up, like Screeps Arena, an RTS where you actually write the AI control code yourself in JavaScript, or AlphaStar, a deep learning AI bot that can play Starcraft 2 at an almost professional level. Considering the time these sorts of projects involve, they are unlikely to represent a disinterested community and demonstrate a certain level of commitment that is very welcome indeed. A quick look at the Steam chart shows that there are still plenty of players. Age of Empires has around 40,000 of them logged in right now, spread among various versions, with another 10,000 to be found between the three Company of Heroes games. These figures aren't anything near the 500,000 you'll find in Dota 2, but they are respectable and, more importantly, consistent. I was especially surprised to find 2,000 people still playing Dawn of War right now. Not bad for a 20-year-old game. From my own personal experience, I really get the impression that the community is invested and enthusiastic about the genre. I might only be running a small channel, but I get plenty of comments and other interactions from people that obviously have a very deep passion for the subject matter. They don't always agree with me or each other, but they do have a lot of thoughts about the games they love, things they dislike, and the sorts of things they would like to see in the future. So how exactly is RTS doing? Well, if you take out the obvious outlier, then I guess it's still pretty healthy. Studios still release games for us to play, communities keep the older games accessible, and as long as you don't get too attached to any one single title, then it's not hard to find other people to play with or against. This is something that's pretty much true for most genres. I still like shooters myself. Day of Defeat was one of my favourites, but I don't expect that I'll have any luck finding anyone still playing that, but there are plenty of other options, so it's not a problem for me. So, next time someone says RTS is dead, just shrug your shoulders. They'll probably spout some inane babble about MOBAs and then dribble it all out into a clickbaity YouTube thumbnail, but that's fine, you know better now, because you've listened to a guy on the internet talk for 15 minutes, and that pretty much counts as independent research these days. But let's be honest with ourselves. RTS is and always has been a bit of a niche. Sure, it had a huge explosion in the late 90s and early 2000s when it first came about, but things have settled down a lot since then, and you're hardly likely to find the same sort of general excitement about a new RTS game as you would with a new shooter, RPG or big cash-grabbing Star Wars mess. And that's totally fine, it's a big world and niche experiences aren't a problem anymore. People that listen to jazz don't care that hip hop is more popular. Musicians still record jazz, you can still play your old records, and you can still get into heated discussions with other jazz fans about exactly which manufacturer makes the best cup mute. So, RTS is fine, you're fine, now stop watching YouTube and go and build a cool bass. Hi there, thanks for your time and bandwidth, I appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button or join the discussion with the comments section or the Discord server. And if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel and I hope to see you back soon.